So I'm really delighted that we have John Farenden with us this morning. John is seen as the doyen policy advisor on shared care records for NHS England. He's been involved for many years and he's a senior programme lead since 2017. He'll be taking a philosophical approach today, which I hope will inspire a range of questions. His intriguing title today is, as you can see, Ellie, Clare, Branwen and Jane, A Tale of 4 Women. Thank you, and over to John.
Great. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me clearly, and thank you very much for inviting me along today to talk. I'm not going to talk about the Shared Care Records programme today. I'm not going to talk about commitments, deadlines, funding, milestones, metrics. I'm not going to talk about technology, but I'm going to talk about some people and their stories. And what I want to do today is to encourage us to think more person when we talk about sharing records and plans. And I'm conscious that some of this may actually prove a little uncomfortable. So I'm going to start with a photograph of my elder daughter, Eleanor. That's her at 19 years old. She had just finished her first year at university and was going from being a schoolgirl into a very confident young woman. She's been very fortunate in her life chances and is now in Australia undertaking doctorate research in remote monitoring of Indigenous Australians with diabetes. So she's been very fortunate. But I want to talk about Brooke, who was aged the same age as my daughter in that photograph. And Brooke had none of those life chances. She was in a very dark place, so dark, in fact, that some 3 years ago, she took her own life while suffering from a mental illness. And these are hard, cold words from the coroner's report. She had emotionally unstable personality disorder, and she hung herself. And the coroner had an opportunity to do a report. And I don't suppose there's many on the audience who are desperately familiar with paragraph 7, schedule 5 of the Coroners and Justices Act 2009, alongside regulations 28 and 29 of the Coroners Investigation Regulations of 2013. And these are quite interesting in the sense they give a power to coroners to require, and that's not to ask or request, but require the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care to respond to concerns raised by coroners in relation to deaths where they consider there are potential systemic problems. In other words, it's not a one-off death. And of course, the Secretary of State for Health doesn't write the responses directly. That duty falls to people like me. And this case, in the case of Brooke, was one of those. And you can see here, highlighted in red, some of the key points from the coroner's inquiry into Brooke's death. And you can see that there are 2 major things about the fact that we're not sharing information. And on its own, this is a tragic case, but it's worse. It's far from unique. Amy, a woman to age 23, had problems trying to contact an out of hour GP. They weren't able to access information from her regular GP records. Had that happened, they might have had a different line of inquiry and they may have determined a different treatment pattern and they might have saved her life. Julie, a woman of 42, another example, an acute trust could not access community trust records and as a result, information was not shared and she passed away. Irvine, 66-year-old, community REACT teams didn't have access to hospital trust records. Tamara, a young girl of 13, she encountered in 4 years medical professionals 47 times in different parts of the health service. And the coroner identified that there was no coordinating record of all those occasions that she saw the medical professionals. And without that, each case was treated almost as a unique incident. Career Marie, same thing, sharing of information by different services within the same trust and other NHS trusts. Stephen, again, another challenge between the mental health world and the physical world. He had a history of mental health problems, and it was assumed that his particular circumstances related to those, but actually it was a physical issue that caused his death. Oops. Another John, mental health crisis. Same thing, the GP didn't access mental health service records. Olive, medication changed, and as a result, she passed away because they didn't know about the medications, that information being shared. Beryl, ultrasound exam was not reported. This wasn't a death, but she was actually readmitted as a result because the GP didn't realise what had happened to her. A Shire. Again, this one wasn't a death, but actually she did die, but not related to this. But what I was worried about was that the trust said, well, the missing blood gas results, it's not considered worthy of further action. You know, why is that allowed? And so my challenge to us is, why don't we think of these as never events in the same way that our clinical colleagues have never events? These are things that we can prevent. They don't have to happen. People's information can be shared and we can save lives and avoid harm. So my next story is actually another personal one about Clare, who's my late mother-in-law. She passed away last November, aged 94, and was a fairly typical, frail, older person with multi-morbidities. And I tend to think that all of us have somebody like a Clare in our lives. She came to live with us as she lost her independence. And over that 12-month period she lived with us, she had contacts with all these different organisations involved in the delivery of health and care services to her. Her house was in one part of the country, and although we were only 13 miles away, we were in a different clinical commissioning group and local authority area. And it didn't just happen overnight. She'd stop with us a couple of days and then go back, and then stopped a week, and then went back, and then stopped a fortnight. And so it was a gradual change. And so over that 12 months, she encountered 24 different providers of health and care services, and none of them had a complete picture of her life. The only people who did were my wife and I, and even that was an opaque picture because we didn't know quite what all the medications she'd been prescribed were meant to do. So even when you're informed, it's hard work to try and join all these things up. And now I'm going to talk something a little closer to home in Dorset. Now,
what kind of businesses are you looking for?
I have the highest regard for everything that Dorset Care Record team are doing, and nationally, we really value the way that you talk about what you're doing, engage with the public. And indeed, only yesterday, the National Senior Responsible Officer for Shared Care Records, Tim Donohoe, commented how visible you are in promoting all the things that you do. And your neighbours in Somerset have also made great strides in sharing information. But even with such great work, we need to remind ourselves there are still many challenges to face, and here's why. So Jane is a lady who lived in Yetminster in Dorset, North Dorset. In November last year, she had a mental health crisis, and she was taken in the early hours of the morning by Dorset police and paramedics to Yeovil Hospital, which is only 6.2 miles away from her home, 14 minutes by car. And that's the journey on the map that you can see. After she was treated by the psychiatric liaison team at Yeovil, she was discharged. And she left the hospital to walk home down the A37, 6 miles, 4 o'clock in the morning, in temperatures of 7 to 9 degrees centigrade. And she was dressed in leggings and a t-shirt. On her route, she was stopped by the Somerset Navan Police, but they allowed her to continue. They had no reason to do anything about her condition. At midday the following day, she was found dead in a field by the A37. Now, the coroner's report identified that the cause of death was as a result of hypothermia and the excessive use of tramadol, pain reliever. And it was a combination of those factors, and that she'd taken an overdose of prescribed medication that had caused her to die. And in the inquest evidence, once again, we see that we have a lack of information, a lack of access to information. As they reported it, one trust can't see the data on another trust. And this has been addressed. The positive thing is that it was responded to quite positively by the organisations involved, and we're improving the way in which we exchange information across those boundaries. And again, allowing access to records across the NHS on a national basis will provide better care to patients and prevent future deaths. And again, the concerns that were placed in front of the Secretary of State for Health requiring a response was that we did have accessibility to records across the country. But there's an interesting thing here in that second paragraph, that the same issue serves with police forces. When the Dorset police turned right onto the A37 to take her to Yeovil, they crossed the border. And so when their colleagues in Avon and Somerset police saw her later on that morning, they didn't know about her mental condition. And if they had done, if they'd known a bit about what had happened with the Dorset police colleagues, they might have given her a lift home or taken her to a place of safety. They simply didn't know the risk that she presented to her own welfare. So it's not just about the health service that has challenges in terms of sharing information. Other parts of the public services do as well. Now to talk to Branwen. Branwen's a teacher in London, and she has contributed to the One London Shared Record Initiative by wanting to tell her story about some of her experiences so we can learn from that. And her story was that she felt unwell after a minor operation, and she encountered all different parts of health services, GP, hospital consultants, and so forth. And then, she struggled with this lack of joined-up care. And you can read Branwen's story on the One London website, and I'm sure you will have similar ones. But when she looked at it through her eyes, as she says, if the clinicians I was speaking to had access to all of me, a holistic, up-to-date, shared information about my history, my previous appointments, investigations, it would have been life-changing. So it took 18 months for her diagnosis. Had that information been available sooner, it could have been she could have been identified considerably sooner and her treatment started. And it's sad that she makes that comparison about when you bring your car to a garage for an MOT, the mechanics know all about the history of your vehicle. So I want to set the challenge is, why is this so hard? What is it that makes it so hard for us to do this and share information in this way? The concept isn't new. This is a document from 20 years ago at the beginning of the National Programme for IT. And it talked about the concept of an integrated care record service. And it was integrated across the whole care continuum, primary, secondary, community care. It covered both health and social care. It suggested a single record based around the person. And it was a service, not just because we want to buy a system and a product, but to think about all the services that are required to effectively support professionals in the delivery of care and the change management and clinical pathway redesign that's needed. So the concept isn't new. We've evidence of benefit. This is an example from in West Devon. A GP organised a cross-organisational multidisciplinary team looking at a thing called the Comprehensive Geriatric Assessment, which is for people with medium to severe frailty. And they concluded that by taking a CGA approach, which involves looking at the person holistically, effectively one record, it improved the length of life of those individuals and also meant that they when they did pass away, they passed away in a care home, their place of preference, not in a hospital. So there's quality and length of life implications from doing things in a much more coordinated way. So I think this statement from the author Anais Nin struck me. She said, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. And what I think that means is that we tend to look through our own lens of the organisation that we work for, and we don't necessarily manage to step outside of that and look at it from the perspective of the other people that we're trying to support. So although we talk about person-centred solutions, quite often it's from the perspective of the person that, say, a hospital sees, and it's not about the hospital that the person sees. And I think one of the things I want to get over today is to try and make sure we're always standing in the shoes of the individual. My final one is another story, a sad story about Victoria Climbier. And some of you may remember this, again, 22 years ago. She was murdered by her great aunt and her boyfriend who were meant to be looking after her. And she had a horrific experience of child abuse. And Lord Laming undertook an inquiry, and at the time I was working in the Department of Health and I had the job of reviewing his report. It was published in January 2003. It consisted of 432 pages and no less than 106 recommendations covering some of the most horrific experiences and the failure of public services. 3 things, he said. Information sharing is not taking place. Information about Victoria was dotted all over the place in terms of the interaction she had with different parts of health and social care services, and it was never joined up. There was no single set of records. Even within some of the organisations that she encountered, they didn't have a single record. And then he also said there's this mythology that information governance prevents us from sharing information. Now, I fully accept there can be risks associated with information sharing, but I've never had to comment on a case where that's happened and the coroner has said somebody has died and there's been a risk that the information was shared inappropriately. But as you can see from what I've been talking about today, I've seen many coroners' reports where information hasn't been shared when it should. And as you've seen from Jane's story, we're still seeing people whose deaths or harm might have been avoided had we shared information. And so what I want to do today is encourage us all to be thinking more about the person and less about the provider. So our language is often things about GP records and hospital records and social care records, but let's think of it as the person's record that is contributed to and consumed by people in general practice, in hospitals, social workers, and actually the individual contributes to. So I can tell my story once and expect all those that I encounter in the health and care system to be able to understand about me. And I'll go back to my mother-in-law, Clare. She encountered, when she had advanced Alzheimer's, people saying, well, she's not very responsive to us. We try and talk to her and she doesn't respond. And it turned out that they didn't realise that her first name is Mary and she always goes by her second name of Clare. So when they were trying to get Mary to respond, it was no wonder she didn't reply because she didn't recognise that name. And if we'd been able to tell them that that's actually one of the characteristics, call her Clare, then they might have reacted and responded in a better way. And so the upshot of all of this is that although I said I wasn't going to talk about our programme, actually our top priority project for 22-23 nationally is to support the exchange of information between the shared care records that we've got in place and the wonderful work that's been going on all over the country that helps people within an integrated care system. And what we now need to do is scale that up to work nationally. So when a Dorset resident does get taken to a Somerset hospital or one in Hampshire or in Devon, then their treating clinicians will have access to the same level of information as if they'd gone to Bournemouth or Dorchester. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Some really thought-provoking case studies there. And we're going to throw this open now to questions. I can't see any in the chat at the moment, but so if you'd like to put them in the chat or raise your hand and ask some questions. I've got a question which I'll kick off, and I have kind of pre-warned John about it. So my question, and I think, you know, given your kind of people-centric line, I think I almost know the answer, but we're kind of dealing at the moment with private healthcare company that has access to UHD, to the EPR, to I think it's alerts and referrals, wanting to join the DCR. Now we have a DCR. If you get into the DCR, have access to the DCR, you see everything. So we're kind of wrestling with that. So my question really is should private healthcare companies have access to shared care records?
Well, I think, yes, as you've seen, what I'm trying to do is encourage us to think about the individual and what they would expect. And they might well expect that when they've gone to see a private healthcare provider, for whatever reason, that information is about them. It's about their health, their condition, their well-being. And I think they expect that to be available to people that they might encounter in the NHS, because they may be prescribed medications, there may be other treatments which have an important factor to play should they be taken into an A&E department, for example, and possibly vice versa. So I think there's both a public and patient expectation about what they would like to have shared, and I think there's also a clinical safety issue associated with this. But as ever, what we need to do is be very open and transparent with people. We need to explain the benefits of doing this, and we need to make sure that they have the opportunity to express their concerns and objections, and we manage those carefully. But I think philosophically, if we think about the person and their life to death record, that includes all the interactions, not just with the public services, but with private services, voluntary sector organisations, and others who may have a contribution to make to their health and well-being. And so I think if we take a person-centred view, we should not necessarily draw the line between a service that's publicly funded and one that's privately funded. How we do that, that's going to be a challenge, and that's one of the things that we've identified on our roadmap, not for this coming year, but for the year afterwards. We'd like to explore that and think how we can make that happen better. But again, you know, we need to have that conversation with the public and see how they feel about it and what their expectations are.
Thank you, John. That's really helpful. I think we've got a question from PDJ Greensmith. I think you're going to be unmuted. Please ask your question. Catherine, are you able to unmute?
Apologies, I am trying to, but having a bit of trouble. Bear with me.
If Stuart or Malcolm, I've got questions from Malcolm Gerald, Stuart Glanville. If you'd like to put them in the chat in the meantime, then we can kind of press ahead with those questions.
Tony, everyone's back on mute mics now, so you should be able to hear.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so Mr. Greensmith, yes, Greensmith? Far away.
Okay, thank you. Mine's, as you said, going back to this joined up integrated approach, if you like, within Dorset. I looked at mine. I'm discussing with other people how it can roll out across the southwest, and I can only find information from DCH in Dorchester on me. There's nothing on my pool appointments. There's nothing about my GP surgery. There's nothing about Dorset Healthcare, so the community services and appointments and information I've got there. So when is it going to be joined up across Dorset?
So I think I might have to defer to colleagues from Dorset in terms of their local plan. What we're trying to do nationally is ensure that there's a momentum to encourage that integration. We feel it is better to empower local systems who know better their population and can engage with the public better. And we need to put in pieces of what we call national infrastructure that enables that to happen. As you can imagine, there are an awful lot of places where people encounter health and care services. And so it's a progressive thing. It won't happen overnight, but we've got places where that happens sooner rather than later. As an example, in London, there are as a shared record that covers many, I think all of the trusts and general practice across the whole of London, and they get 1 million views a month. I'm sure the Dorset data is comparative, but it's going to take time to connect people together. We need to make sure it's done safely and securely so that one professional recognises what another professional has written. We need to make sure we put in provisions to allow patients to express their own views about what is shared and what isn't shared. And some of these things are complex to organise. So I think of it as a journey. We've made various commitments to try and make sure there is national interoperability by the end of 2024. And that's really where we're trying to head to. But different parts of the country are working at different speeds, and we're trying to support those who perhaps got the furthest to go at the moment.
Thank you, John. Just a little bit from the Dorset Care Record perspective, just to follow that up. So we have moved quite considerably over the last 2 years. So Dorset County Hospital, you've mentioned, records from Dorset County Hospital. They put everything, all their feeds in that they promised, which is great. Well, we're still awaiting some pathology and discharge medications from UHD. So you won't be able to kind of have those at the moment, or the pathology, we're making real progress. And we are working with local authorities and Dorset Healthcare and making progress. But these things, unfortunately, they do take time, and it can't be done quite at a click of a button, but we are making progress. But if you want to follow this up with us, please send us an email and we can follow that up. Next question, I think, is from Malcolm Gerald.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yes, my question is really, or point really, is this. I think great presentation. The fact that it's taken so long not to get all that far with joining up records suggests to me that it's a very complicated thing to do. There's lots of desire, we all want to do it, and it's obvious, and every clinician in the country would agree with it, but it's very complex. And my concern with the sort of more philosophical approach, which I wouldn't disagree with for a minute, is that it's another start again, let's get somewhere eventually. And to me, the thing that's the most effective and simplest sharing thing that we've had recently is the GP Connect record. It's brilliant. except it does not yet share correspondence. Now, the benefit of driving this, they say they will, I don't know what the time frame is, but the GP is historically the sink for the common health record. Everybody seen in every hospital in the country has a letter sent to their GP, which isn't an entire clinical record, which is far too much to read, but it's a concise, pointed summary of what's happened in the hospital. So it's actually more valuable in many ways than what's actually happened in the hospital, unless you are another specialist, which is different. We're not going to see hospital records being shared easily in any time soon, I'm sorry. In our own trust, patients seen in ED, they haven't got a clinical record because the paper takes too long to get out and we don't yet have a proper EPR. And even when we do, it's only being developed in parts. Whereas the GP record is there, and it's already got the correspondence from the very trust where the patient's recording were being seen, and it's visible all over the country. So if we can just crack the issue of sharing the GP correspondence, and I know it's very hard from people like System 1 who don't really want to open up, but if we can do that, we've done probably 85% of this job. There are other things that need to be done as well, which is, as someone has commented, adding the patient's perspective and who am I and respect and all the rest of it. But a lot of that can be actually done through the correspondence stored in GP records as a quick fix. And then by all means, dream up and think of wonderful ways of getting everything to share elsewhere and in other ways. But it's going to take so long. We need a quick fix. People are dying every day because of this issue. And we are not, to my mind, yet coming up with a de facto today quick win, and it's actually, I think, staring us in the face. It's personal view. Comment, please.
Well, no, I agree, and it's actually, I'll give credit to one of your colleagues in Gloucestershire, Dr. Paul Atkinson. At the beginning of the pandemic, Paul came to one of our national events and talked about the summary care record which exists. And for those who aren't familiar, the summary care record is effectively a national record. Almost everybody in the country who hasn't explicitly opted out has a summary care record, although generally speaking, it's a very thin record. It just has some key medication information and a few other things about allergies. And it is widely used, but that you can extend it. And Paul said, actually, if you had an opt-out option for extending your summary care record, which is a subset of the GP record, as you described, actually it would make a difference. And we discussed with the Information Commissioner's Office, the National Data Guardian, the Royal College of General Practitioners and the BMA, and they all agreed that under the circumstances of the pandemic, switching from an opt-in to an opt-out would be a good thing. And we moved from having 3.5 million records with an extended summary care record, which I say is a subset of the GP record, readily available, to one where there are now 55 million records. And that has saved lives. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And we've had lots of feedback. So that exists now. It's not perfect, but it actually exists now and people are using it. And so this isn't an either or. We have some things in place at the moment. They may not be the perfect thing, but they are better than not having them. And we want to see this as a sort of evolutionary program, using the tools that we have to hand while we perhaps build something that's a little bit slicker, a bit more sophisticated in the meantime. So if anybody's interested, I'd certainly be happy to talk at another stage on the summary care record and how that can be used to support some of that interventions across different borders. But as you can see from some of those case studies, it's still not solving that problem today. So we have a lot of work still to do, I think. But thank you for raising that.
Thank you for that question. I think we have Paul Atkinson. Paul has put a couple of things in the chat box. Paul, do you want to say anything more about that?
I think what I would say is just be very humble to say, I was one voice coordinating. I think the letter that we sent in to Sarah and to Matthew Gold was co-signed, I think, by all 6 or all 7 of the CCGs in the Southwest. So I think I was just a precipitating factor, but it was something. It was interesting. It was something we'd talked about in the Southwest for quite some time as part of the One Southwest Laker, and I think it took COVID to give it enough traction to actually make something we'd talked about for a long time actually happen. So yeah.
Thank you, Paul. I've got a question in the chat box from Stuart Glanville. Stuart says, the work you did with others like Paul and Clare at the start of COPE helped SWAST through the summary care record. So thank you for that. I feel that some of the projects which NHS England are encouraging through perhaps the NHS UTF, for example, virtual wards, are encouraging organisations to go separate ways rather than adopting a national patient-centred approach. Can you comment on that, John?
Yes, I hope that's not me making that noise. Yeah, you're quite right. We have seen some initiatives, and we're kind of looking at them now and saying, actually, we kind of got to round them up and put them back into the standards framework. And we are actively looking at some of those. So I think your diagnosis is right, and we're trying to think about the right kind of treatment for correcting that. But we do have the risk that we end up with pools of data which might serve the immediate purpose, but actually then make it a lot harder to bring it together at a later stage. And of course, as people move around the country, their record needs to move with them rather than the situation we have at the moment. And so if they've captured data from, say, one remote monitoring device, one sort of technology in one part of the country that's not compatible with the same one that they have in a new part of the country, we've got another question about looking at the continuity of the data that comes from those things. It's always a trade-off between doing something quickly and doing something that's taking quite a long time to think through. I just accept it. Yes, we're trying to tackle it. Yeah, we know it's a problem. Yeah, we're not.
Thank you for your question, and thanks for the answer, John. So a question from Toby Page from Leicestershire, a partnership NHS Trust, and it related to Malcolm's point earlier. So he says, during our discovery work undertaken during rollout of our shared care record in Leicestershire and Rutland, the importance of GP-derived data has been highlighted. However, HTML views via GP Connect mean that it's very hard to present this data alongside other relevant information. The release of structured GP Connect feeds seem very slow in coming. Can these be expedited, please?
Yes, that is something we definitely want. We want to speed up. I mean, again, that involves us conversations with the major GP system suppliers and ensuring that what they're able to provide us. There's a technical challenge there, but there's also a way in which it's presented, because it wouldn't be helpful if we found that the structured data was then presented in different ways. We have to think about how we present that best. And I think that's one thing we have learned quite a lot. This, it's not good enough just to collect all the data together and say, there you are, put it on the table. We have to think about how different professionals will use it in different contexts. So a paramedic needing some information while they're out on a call is likely to want a different sort of view of that information from a GP or a psychiatrist that might want a lot of richer view. So we need to be thinking about the concept of filters that bring to the attention of the professional the information that they need most often at the top, as it were. And you're quite right, by doing structured data flows, you can start thinking about how you can customize the interface for individual professionals so that they see what they need to see and don't get overwhelmed by vast amounts of data. The structured data flow is absolutely fundamental, and it's happening in some places. It's just again, one of those things that takes quite a lot of time to assure, to make sure we get it right, because if we get it wrong, there could be all sorts of serious consequences.
Thank you. Question around opt-out, information consent, and what can and cannot be opted out of causes confusion. Information is essential to effective healthcare. So should people be allowed to opt out of information sharing when it could put their lives at risk?
Oh dear, philosophically. So, first of all, we, as you may know, we did a lot of work in producing what we called the Information Governance Framework for Shared Care Records, which we published, and that tries to set out very clearly the legal position and what we believe good practice looks like in respect of the sharing of information for direct care purposes. It's also quite clear that there's some professional obligations in here. Patients have a right to object to information sharing, but it's a professional duty to make a judgment call as to whether that objection should be upheld or whether there are extenuating circumstances where they think perhaps the individual involved is putting their own welfare and possibly that of others at risk. And I think it's generally accepted that there's a concept of implied consent in the circumstances where it is to do with the direct care of the patient. You're right, it can be confusing. I mean, Lord Laming said, that's an excuse that people gave in the Climbia case, oh, well, we're not allowed to share. Actually, there is a duty to share, which is as strong as the duty to protect. And I think what we should be doing, if we trust professionals with our lives, we should trust them with making judgments about information sharing on our behalf as well. But it needs to be done in partnership. It needs to have a conversation if that's what's needed. But I think we certainly have seen from public engagement events, and I'm sure you'll have had them, there's a public expectation that information is shared far more than it actually is. And so we perhaps, I wouldn't say over cautious, we need to be cautious, but we really should start from the premise that the public expects us to share the information, but to give them the opportunity to control that, even if they decide not to exercise that opportunity.
Thank you, John, for that. Are there any further questions? I can't see, might have missed some in the chat box, but does anyone else have any further questions for John? Yes, Paul.
Oh, right. Yes, I can see one.
So, hi, John. So I suppose it's a question and a comment.
Yes.
I think it would be amiss of me not to slightly correct the earlier point about summary care record. That, of course, a lot of this actually also, as well as the letter that came in, was also, I think, my colleague Clare needling Sarah Wilkinson in front of 300 people may have been precipitous. So I think it is worth remembering that was quite a pivotal moment in the conversation as well. No, my question was about sort of policy and strategy, and obviously the upheaval that we know is happening with NHS England, Digital X, all coming together into a new directorate. Do you think there'll be some clarification about the data sharing agenda that we can see sometime soon, or is that forming, storming, norming process still ongoing?
It's a kind of mixture of the two things. There is clearly turbulence as we kind of bring the organisations together and work out whose job it is to do what particular task. That doesn't mean to say the task has disappeared. It's still there. It just has to go through that turbulence for a while. It is absolutely clear, Paul, that we need to be setting out clarity on what public can expect in terms of sharing and what rights they have. The new data strategy, which I believe is going to be published next month, has right at the heart of it about building and maintaining public trust and confidence in the way that we share data. And that will be followed through by a clear campaign to make sure that that's transparent to people. I wonder whether you're just going to ask your question. You said in chat, one question I have is about parts of the health record that I argue are not the patients. Yes, I mean, I suppose what I'm just trying to do is to get us to get a more balanced view and think about it from both the professional's perspective and the patient's perspective as equal partners in this. And that's probably where I'm going. You're quite right around safeguarding concerns. But again, that's a professional responsibility. We have to trust the people that we've given that responsibility to make those decisions in the best interests of the people that they're caring for. Technology alone won't solve that.
No, so at risk of conflating programs, I think my comments were partially thinking it's this tension, isn't it, that we need to share those suspicions and those thought processes with each other.
Yes.
I think that's one of the things that was pulled out in the Climbia report, is that lots of points of touch and that overall view wasn't seen.
Yeah.
And elsewhere we're engaging in a program where we're going to make that particularly the GP record available to all citizens by default, which gives me concerns because there's material in there that is not factual. Some of that is my thought process that is either there for my benefit or for the benefit of the clinician who sees the patient next. Yeah. Mrs. Biggins is looking tired and has walked into the door handle again. If she's alone next time, maybe we should have a chat about this. and the concerns about citizens' mobile phone, at home behind closed doors. Is it really a private device? But I appreciate that's not necessarily your programme.
No. If it was simple, we'd have done it by now, I suspect. It isn't. We have to get that balance right. We're not ignoring that, Paul, at all.
John, question from Joe around coping notices.
Yes.
Obviously introduced, with the onset of COVID pandemic a couple of years ago. Understand that that's not being renewed in June. Could you comment on that, please, particularly in light of the benefits to patients that it has demonstrated?
Yes, I can't give the chapter and verse, but I'm pretty sure that some of my colleagues have looked and concluded that actually there is no need to revert back to what we were before. Paul may well remember that in those early days when we were changing the opt-in to an opt-out for the summary care record, there was a lot of debate about what would happen if the coping notices were rescinded. Will we have to revert back? I believe my colleagues have concluded that because it's being used for direct care purposes, it can be taken as implied consent, and that as long as we're giving patients clarity under the circumstances on which it is shared and given them the opportunity and ask for permission to view, then it can stay as it is. But I think I would need to go back and confirm that. So please don't publish that in a newspaper at the moment. I would need to get that confirmed. But certainly the intention is to maintain that because of the benefits that it achieved and the impact it had on improving patient care. We wouldn't want to go back.
Okay, thank you, John.
Claire.
Claire's.
Yes.
Want to tackle that one?
Was that you were asking me? Yes. So Claire was just commenting on the work that she's been doing with the Southwest ICSs.
Yeah. I can come in on that. It's a focus of mine. I'm shortly to take up a role with NHS England to try and crack this, which John's aware of. We, as a region, our highest common denominator in terms of patient care record sharing is SWAST, and we really don't do it very well. We cannot expect our paramedics to access different shared care records. It's unacceptable, and I think it's an absolute priority that we crack this from Dorset to Bristol to Gloucestershire to Cornwall and all the ones in between, because it's an unacceptable status quo that we're in at the moment. So I'll get off my soapbox and let John comment on that.
No, it's a very pertinent point. We've been struggling with Dorset with that as well.
No, and I think that's important to recognise that while the integrated care system is an important unit of planning, there are many services, and you've identified ambulance services, but there are other clinical networks, there are national specialist services that cross over all sorts of boundaries. So, and as one of my case studies illustrated, those boundaries are artificial in many cases. So we have to think about how this works on a national interoperability basis. And particularly for visitors who are visiting Devon and Cornwall from other parts of the country, SWAS shouldn't sit there and say, well, we can't look at your records because you come from Oxfordshire. That's not going to work. We have to make sure there's equity of access for patients across the whole of England. And that's why that interoperability thing is so important. We put some foundation pegs in place around the integrated care systems. We now need to kind of build the connector that connects them together. And as you rightly say, we don't want people to have to log into separate systems. That's not a good use of time, and it's risky. We want things to be integrated into the primary clinical system they use day to day, whether that's a paramedic or a GP or a hospital doctor or a nurse in the community.
Thank you, John, for that. I think we've got time for one more question if there is one. But if not, I'd like to thank John very much indeed for a real tour de force in terms of his case studies and also answering a range of questions right across his remit and probably a little bit beyond. Thank you for that, John. And thank you to all our guests today for your questions, your comments in the chat box. And I'd just like to wish you a great day.